Now, some say that strength training and lifting heavy weights is bad for your back and if you have sciatica, especially. However, the research has shown otherwise, and as long as we're able to truly manage our load, mechanics, and recovery, we should be able to build up our strength to stronger than our pre-injured state. But you shouldn't do it alone, and our guest today is Katie Feely, who is an online strongman coach as well as part of the Strongman Corporation. And we sit down with her in today's episode, and in the show, we actually talk about her history of injury and back pain, mechanics that can occur when injured, and how to properly return back into an activity like lifting heavy weights such as strongman. And so as of this recording, my daughter has transitioned into a sleep regression. And let's say that my sleep has declined quite a bit. But luckily I had Magic Mind focus shots who helped me get a little boost of energy and focus throughout the day. I purposely held off on the nighttime calm shots as I needed to be able to get up and rock our daughter back to sleep and put her back to bed. And so I'm actually glad to say that I'm still limiting my coffee to just 1 cup per day. I'm not over caffeinated and I'm feeling pretty good despite the lack of sleep. So if you're looking to boost your mental clarity during the day and improve your sleep at night, then Magic Mind has actually created their 24-hour pack that is covering both day and night with a 45% discount. You can claim your discount at the affiliate link in the show notes. And on with the show.
This is the Fix Your Sciatica podcast.
Okay, so let's talk about strongman. It is a sport that you often see on television, includes lifting way heavier weights than I would ever have actually come across. And this is an amazing sport that I have a huge respect. And as a physical therapist, I have 2 different choices. I have choice number 1, which is going to be, well, these athletes, good luck with them later in life as they're trying to nurse their injuries. Or the second part is I can embrace the sport and say, these are the things that we need to consider in order for us to be in the sport for a longer period of time. And then also when we say eventually do retire in the sport, how can we live a healthy life? And pretty much in essence, today's focus is going to be, when you're a strongman athlete, how can you actually get through training while injured, specifically dealing with sciatica pain and low back pain, which is often interrelated. But then the second part is, once you are healed, what are some key strategies for you to actually return back into competing and training in strongman without ever having to worry about your old injuries? And in addition to myself talking about the physical therapy and movement side of it, I have an actual professional in the strongman world who is a longtime friend of mine, Katie Feely, who has been a guest probably about a year or so back. We were talking about deadlifts. And she has had an amazing journey in strongman and is actually part of the big strongman circuits. Katie, welcome back. It's so great to see you. Thanks for being today's guest.
Thank you for having me. I'm always happy to talk about strongman things.
It is definitely something that I love watching on ESPN. And as a physical therapist, I can break all these movements down. And the reality is that, one, it's an intimidating sport, but also it could be a very beneficial sport for a lot of people, especially when it comes to developing what we like to call that functional strength. And we know that especially as we age, it is important for us to add resistance. And there's ways for us to add resistance, but we also have to look at how does it tie into our normal lives. And what's really cool about strongman is that we're lifting loads that we never thought could be possible. And I know especially a lot of people are looking at, how can I get back into the sport while I'm hurt, or should I even consider getting back into it? And I thought you'd be the perfect person to really go over the details about that. But before we take a deep dive, for the listeners who haven't met you, tell us a little bit more about yourself and like what you do and your role in like the strongman circuit.
Sure. So I have been doing strongman specifically for 12 or 13 years now, competitively, and coaching it for slightly less time than that, and promoting competitions, so hosting shows for almost 10 years, and then coaching athletes to compete in shows at various levels. So I have experience on the athlete side and the coaching side and the competing side and the promoting side. So I'm kind of coming at it from a bunch of different angles. And currently my main focuses are, I coach clients online for Strongman and general strength and fitness. And I work with Strongman Corporation, which is one of the big governing bodies of Strongman in the US and internationally, and helping them to run competitions and helping local promoters to run their competitions. So all kinds of Strongman things all the time.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I mean, you're really deep in the weeds with everything. And yeah, that was one of the things that really allowed us to get linked up, because you have a lot of really great knowledge of the sport. So for the listeners out there who aren't quite familiar with what Strongman is, tell us a little bit more about what it is. How is it different than other, we'll say, like modalities, but then also from a competition standpoint? Like, what are we looking at here?
Sure. So Strongman does include aspects of what you would normally consider lifting. So barbells, dumbbells, squats, squat, bench, deadlift, press, like normal, quote unquote, normal lifting. The thing that makes Strongman different from that is that in a competitive sense, we're using implements that I would just say are odd objects. So kegs, stones, vehicles, sandbags. So all the stuff that's not a traditional like barbell, kettlebell, dumbbell, essentially. The other thing that I really love about Strongman is that it's a few different modalities. So if we're looking at powerlifting, that's static strength, right? You're standing or laying down in one place and doing one lift. Strongman has some static movements, so you'll see things like deadlifts come up in various forms, but there's also things like throwing. There's moving events, so where you're like carrying things on your back or carrying things in your hand or in front of your body. There's overhead pressing events. There's medleys, so you're moving between different implements. Sometimes you're going from moving into pressing. Like there's so many different combinations of things. So it's a mix of strength, power, agility. And I think that's kind of one of the things that makes Strongman in the strength sports world very unique, is that it draws on all these other sports and kind of mushes them all into one really unique experience. And then it's like, also, let's lift a car. So you get to do some really fun stuff that friends and family are very impressed by as a bonus.
I like to think about it as kind of like feats of strength, which is
very much, very much
so cool. One of the As a physical therapist, I've been practicing since 2012. So here we are at the start of 2025. So we're saying going on 13 years. I was an endurance athlete in college. I retired from swimming, went to grad school, and that's actually where I discovered, say, something like CrossFit. I needed something a little bit more competitive. I needed something that kind of pushed me rather than just going to the gym, because I didn't necessarily have a specific goal. And when I graduated from physical therapy school, and also interestingly enough, during my physical therapy education, we learned about the principles of strength and conditioning and in regards to like reps, sets, and like the weights and everything. And the reality is that the science is actually going to be consistent. The exercise science is going to be the same no matter what your training is. And what I found as I graduated from physical therapy school, and I looked at, all right, well, if I'm going to be focusing on helping people restore their function and getting back into everyday activity, I started looking at how can we start integrating exercises into our daily life. And one of the big things that I really enjoyed about Strongman was actually looking, okay, yeah, this person's lifting a keg, right? Or throwing a keg over their shoulder and having to carry it. Well, the reality is that that's really no different than having to, if you're in your backyard gardening, you have to pick up a bag of soil and then you have to carry it from your car to your garden and vice versa. Or here I am in 2025, I'm a new father. I have to pick up a baby, right? And so I'm picking up a baby. My baby's 13 pounds as of today. That's certainly way less than the 300-pound bag. But what I found to be really cool was the fact that it can extend across all aspects of life, right? Like you pick something up, you put something down, and then even just implementing all those different things. So you have that in essence, what we call the functional aspect of things, which is very, very cool. And so that's what I really appreciate about the sport. Now we know that in Strongman, you're moving like these big heavy resistances, right? And so there's certainly a lot of demands on the body that the sport requires. And so if we can just break down couple of the most popular events, and we'll talk about some of the big demands on the body, just so that we can really lay the groundwork in regards to what we'll talk about later on in this conversation.
Sure. So Strongman is generally broken into a couple different categories of movement. So even though there's a million different things you can do, typically in a competition, you're looking at some kind of overhead pressing event, some kind of deadlift event, some kind of moving event, which is generally a carry or like a sled push or pull, and some kind of loading event. So the most common loading event would be probably stones is the most iconic one. And sandbags are very popular now as well to like load either to shoulder or over something. So those are the big categories kind of movement in strongman, and each one is going to place a slightly different. You're using full body for everything, realistically, but each one is going to have a slightly different focus on what kind of energy systems you're using, what kind of muscles you're using, and what kind of skills you're using.
Very cool. And so if we're looking at these events, which I appreciate you kind of breaking them down, you're right. There's like an endless amount of events that could be happening. So I appreciate these categories and looking into the categories and like the demands on the body. Being that this is a sciatica related podcast, mostly it's going to be related to the lower half of our body. So we're going to be looking at our low back, aka our spine, our hips, and anything in between. And so going into that, we have overhead pressing, we have deadlifts, and we have moving and then loading. So what that tells me is what motions or positions will our spine be with each one of these things. And listeners, if you are a longtime listener, we know that the spine has a couple motions. We have flexion, which is rounding. We have extension, which is arching. We also have side bending, which is kind of like side to side. And then we have rotation. And if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, your doctors are probably like, oh, you should never bend over and touch your toes. You should always arch your back, or you should never do this. You should never do that. You should never twist. You should never side bend. It creates a lot of fear and avoidance, which can actually increase the levels of pain that we have. But the human body is an amazing thing. It's an amazing organism. We're not just like one inert structure. You don't just do something and then you break. It's often an accumulation of stresses, but oftentimes we have to modulate the amount of stress that we accumulate with also the amount of rest that we provide for our body. But then the third component is also, which I find we don't necessarily talk enough in the medical field, is the optimal movement mechanics or efficiency. Because the reality is the fact that if the human body was not made to round forward or pick heavy objects up, strongman is a prime example of people who are lifting, hundreds of pounds, close to 1,000 pounds with a rounded back, with an arched back and everything. So what we're going to be doing for the remainder of this episode is actually going through each specific one of these categories and talk about what happens at the spine, some of the things that we can do specifically to actually protect ourselves from getting hurt. And then eventually we're going to talk about like when you're hurt, what do you need to do to actually get through training and make it so that you can continue to stay strong and healthy. So Katie, are you ready to take that ride with me?
Yes, I'm so ready.
Let's do it. Okay. So let's actually start off with overhead pressing. Interestingly enough, a lot of people think like, I can't hurt my back when I'm doing overhead pressing, or like I shouldn't be overhead pressing because it's bad for my shoulders. Now, we can talk about the benefits of overhead pressing and shoulder health in another episode, but let's talk about the back specifically. So let's take like one of the things that we'll often see on TV, which is like the log press, right? Or like the really thick bar that they have to press overhead, right? The wagon wheel one, right? Yeah. So what's interesting is like if you are imagining this press overhead, this wagon wheel press, like people, I remember looking at it as like a very basic watcher, and I was like, these guys are going to get snapped in half if they're pressing this thing overhead. I was like, how is that possible? So walk us through some of like the key mechanics of this lift, and then we'll break it down from there.
Sure. So it's interesting that you chose log also, because the most serious back injury that I've had in the sport was actually doing a log press. So
wow.
It is definitely a thing. I think it's a thing from two perspectives. One is that in strongman, everything starts on the floor. So even a press, you're going to have to pick the implement up off the floor first, which is going to require good mechanics. It typically looks similar to a deadlift. If you're familiar with Olympic style weightlifting, it's some kind of clean.
This episode is brought to you by the Sciatica Protocol. Experience pain relief directly through your phone, anytime, anywhere. Interested in learning more? Check us out at ifixyoursciatica.com/the-sciatica-protocol.
So in everything that we do, whether we're loading, deadlifting, pressing, whatever, even carrying, the first thing that happens is you have to pick up the thing off the floor to then do the stuff with it. So we're deadlifting all the time, essentially. So there's always going to be some sort of back and low body involved. The weights are obviously a little bit lighter in terms of the overhead movements. On like the deadlift is not usually the hard part of the lift, right? So we tend to kind of not think about it, but it is important. Where the lower back especially and lower body gets involved in the overhead pressing is the position that you have to be in to put the weight over your head safely, which involves a really tight and as neutral as possible spine. So with something like a barbell, you can be very compact in your trunk and very stable and what we would typically think of as a neutral spine. When we start to get bigger implements, so things like logs, which range from 10 to 12 or even more inches in diameter, so that's something that's going to stick out really far from your chest. Now I have to lean a little bit back. So I'm taking my upper back into extension. And one of the things we talk about a lot is keeping as much as possible a more neutral or whatever your natural curve is in your spine in your lower back and really bracing through your core and then getting the extension from your thoracic spine. So my upper body is kind of leaning back a little to create space for the implement and get the weight centered over my midline just like you would in any other lift. And then I'm moving from there, but that's putting me in this extended position that's like, well, maybe not the safest if I haven't trained it well, or if those muscles are already under fatigue because it's the last event of the day, or it's a max weight for me, or whatever reason. So you're putting yourself in a slightly more compromised position just because of the kind of implements that you're using. So an axle is just a fatter bar. That's a little bit less. It's a little bit less awkward than a log, but it's still a similar where like you kind of have to make a few different compensations. And then when we're putting the weight overhead, we also need to stabilize our core when that happens. So we're staying tight in the dip if we're using our legs, which we should be, in the dip and drive. And then as we catch the weight overhead, we also need to make sure that the core stays tight. And then any extension that I've had in my upper back, I need to get rid of that, straighten it all out, and create a nice, stable, tight, upright base. That's actually, for me personally, that's how I got hurt, is that I didn't bring my torso back to neutral again. So my spine, and I had not quite grasped the concept of keeping a nice tight lower back, and I was too extended through my entire spine. And when I caught the weight over my head, my back was like pretty much fully extended and the weight compressed down, and it was not a great time for anyone. So my vertebrae kind of smooshed together, and it was a very sad time. I have since learned from that and then been able to teach other people to not do that also. So a learning experience for everyone. But yeah, I'd say like in terms of your lower back specifically, protecting it in the pick off the floor, even though the weight is lighter, and then making sure that your back is as stable as it can be given the position that you have to be in for the implement that you're pressing overhead, and then refinding really good neutral spine to stabilize the weight overhead, because often that weight isn't going to be perfectly balanced either. So core, and more core, basically.
Yeah, and that makes total perfect sense. Listeners, to kind of give you a visual, if we're looking at so your spine, your back is divided into 3 different sections. Well, actually, technically 4, because you have your cervical spine, you have your thoracic spine, you have your lumbar spine, and then you have your sacrum, which is going to be your sacral spine. Your sacrum itself is actually going to be fused vertebrae. So when it comes to movement, it's going to be really more so at the level of your hips. We look at your low back, which is going to be 5 lumbar vertebrae, and they stack right on top of each other. And that's the area that often gets hurt. But then if we move up to the next step, which we call your thoracic spine, aka your thorax, so that's where your ribs attach as well, and then we move on to your neck. And so what Katie's describing is that when you are pressing overhead, ideally you want to be able to extend at the thoracic spine, so that rib cage area. And why is that so important? If you look at it, we have a rib cage. If with your thoracic spine, you have your rib cage and you have your low back, which is going to be your ab muscles. In your rib cage, you actually have a physical structure that's going to create stability for you, which means that if you look down at your lumbar spine, you only have abdominal muscle and back muscle that is used to support. And muscle needs to contract to create that stability. And so when you are lifting something heavy, whether it be a heavy log or even picking up your child over your head, you are going to be extending it to a certain extent. Like the reality is that we cannot create a relatively flat back 24/7, which is going to be kind of transitioning over and when we're talking about deadlifting and carrying objects. But what that also requires is knowing that, okay, if you are going to be being in an extended spine. And it's all about this concept of, I was saying like consistency and tension. So consistency of position. So if you lift something with an arched back, you should stay with an arched back, but we need to create tension 360 degrees. So that means that top and bottom and also front and back. So if you're arching, yes, your low back muscles are engaged, but you also need to equally engage your abs to create that stability. And I want you to imagine that your spine, especially your low back, is kind of like a tent. And a tent, in order for a tent to withstand the elements, it has to have equal tension across all points. It pulls and allows the tent to be nice and taut. We call them like guy wires. It's like we need to have sufficient tension on both sides in order to have a good solid structure. Because if not, that's where we start to fall apart. And it's the moment we fall apart is where we are at the higher risk of injury. So especially when you are in an extended position, it's like, yeah, we got to get engaged those abs a little bit more. So let's go into the other end of the spectrum. And so instead of mostly like extension-based injuries, which can happen with like an overhead press or even like catching it clean, picking stuff up from the floor, right? So strongman, or let's do the most dynamic, which is like the Atlas stones, right? You're picking something up very low to the ground, which is not a barbell. What are some of the key like things to consider, or what are some of the demands on the body that Atlas stones put on the strongman athlete?
It is one of the most fun and iconic things to do. It is also one of the most physically taxing things to do. And it's one of the things we tell people who are coming into strongman from a strict powerlifting background, especially, or Olympic weightlifting, is you have to forget what you have learned about the flat back for the time being. Because there's almost no way at all to lift an Atlas stone, especially as the stones get bigger, without rounding your back. So there's going to be flexion happening. That's just how it's done. You have to be able to wrap your body around the stone. So there's a couple different ways to pick it off the ground. People basically, it depends on how you're built, how tall you are, how big the stone is, if you're more back dominant or leg dominant, like there's lots of factors to it. So some people are able to pick with a flatter back. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm more of a rounded back deadlifter and stone picker just in general, but it's very much what you just spoke about, which is choose a position, lock in that position, and then stay in that position the whole time. So where we see injuries typically is when there's a especially quick change in position. So if you start really flat and then you load in and you go into that flexion, that's where we see people get hurt more often than people who are starting in flexion and just staying there. So we spend a lot of time, and stones are especially interesting because you're going to go from a pretty extreme amount of flexion as you're kind of wrapping, when the stone's in your lap, especially wrapping your body around the stone, into extension. And again, for someone like me who's smaller, the stones are going to be much, much bigger than me. The only way that I can do this is for me to then extend in the other way to get up onto the platform or over the bar. So my back is going through almost full range of flexion and extension throughout a stone load. A lot of that in terms of safety comes from just training the movement itself, but also in our accessory movements for strongman, we are absolutely hammering all things posterior chain. So all of those supporting muscles that allow me to move with a load back and forth through flexion and extension multiple times, or with an extremely heavy weight, I'm training all of that on the back end as well, so that I'm not just like stones and go home. And I think being able to make transitions from one position to another safely is one of the key elements of being successful and less prone to injury in strongman in general.
I'm in 100% agreement with that. One thing that you did bring up, it was this concept of consistent tension throughout, right? And it's kind of like the overall theme. And I think as an everyday person, like in everyday life, like we don't really think about like trying to create a little bit of tension when we're trying to bend over and pick something up from the floor. And which we shouldn't, like, because the reality is the amount of tension that you create in your body should actually be relative to the thing that you're doing. So like if you're lifting a 400-pound object, you're going to need to brace like you're about to lift 400 pounds as compared to, picking up a pencil off the ground. But the mechanics are still the same regardless of the heaviness or the lightness of the object. And so you also said, like, what I found to be really interesting was that you went through the full range of motion from flexion into extension, but you said under control. So it's you actively getting to those positions versus the act of the specific activity, say the Atlas stone, putting you into that position. And that's where we also have the opportunity to look into the concept of, we'll say, tissue and muscle capacity, the ability to actually withstand the forces that our bodies go through, while also being able to repair ourselves and not get extremely fatigued. There's two main areas in which people will get injured during strongman training. It's either like right at the beginning because there wasn't a proper warm-up or movement primer, or they've reached the point of significant fatigue where they aren't able to bear the load, causing an injury. And so it's important for us to be able to consistently know that we have to create consistent tension. I've said consistent a ton of times already, but we have to have tension throughout our entire system and be able to move with specific control, which what the really cool thing is, the demands of strongman is that we have to exercise control, because you're not going to be able to ballistically, move 300 pounds. Well, maybe some of the big heavyweight strongmen I can, but it's definitely something that we have to look into, is being able to control the motion. And so let's talk about from a programming standpoint, because we have load capacity and then rest. As I was saying, one of the many components is people going into the events or doing the training, whatever they're doing, under fatigue, and then they lose that ability to create tension. What are the most important concepts from like the providing enough stress and getting enough recovery? Like, how do we implement, I'm going to rephrase my question. What are some of the key strategies for strongman competitors or people who do strongman? How can they actually manage their stress and recovery components so then that way they can stay injury free? And then we'll go into the injury aspect of it.
Sure. And I wanted to touch real quick first on one of the things you said about control. And one of the cues that I use all the time is that you have to be in charge. Like, you have to be the boss of the weight. Don't let the weight be the boss of you. And that's true, I think, especially in more dynamic movements where you don't want to let the weights pull you around. You have to tell them where to go. You have to tell your body where to go. You can't just like flail around all willy-nilly and hope for the best. You'll see a lot of people earlier in their strongman careers where like, but it's funny to watch like the coaches and stuff who have been around it for a while watching competitors who move like that, because we all know what's coming, right? Like, there's people that like, are they doing something amazing? Yes, but we're like, it's only a matter of time. That is not a sustainable way to move, and ultimately you need control. And from a competitive aspect too, being under control is also important, because you have to do things like wait for a down command. If you just throw your log and then you have to do another rep, now you got to go get it. Like, it is in your best interest physically and competitively to be in control of the weights all the time, basically. To answer your actual question, training considerations, right? That was the actual question. I think I'm going to mostly talk about this in terms of the most overlooked things. So I think it's pretty obvious / standard, like, you got to squat, you got to deadlift, you got to press. Do the things that are going to make you strong, have a good, strong general foundation of all the things we already know about strength training. The things that I think are unique to strongman and that often get overlooked are, I think, balance and stability, which are very closely related, and working on the tiny muscles that support the rest of the structure and the big muscles. So in my programming, there's a lot of dynamic movement, lateral movement. There's a lot of things with like 5-pound dumbbells, like doing YTIs and stuff for your shoulders. In terms of hips, we do a lot of any kind of lunging you can imagine. There's always some kind of lunging, both forward and backward, side to side. I think anything that's going to contribute to stability, both single arm and single leg, is going to be beneficial for the sport, particularly in moving events. And things are not going to be properly or evenly balanced when you're moving. So creating that stability is helpful. And I program some kind of core work, core stability almost every day for my strongman athletes. Earlier in the conversation, we talked about the like flexion, extension, twisting, and bending, like side to side. So in a strongman sense, we do a lot of very active flexion and extension, which we already talked about. The things we want to not be happening are twisting. Generally in strongman, if you're twisting, something has gone terribly wrong, and bending side to side. So those are the aspects that we want to train more statically and stability related things. So using like side planks, suitcase carries, or like single-sided barbell carries, Copenhagen planks, anything that's making me be in that position and fight some kind of rotation or fight some kind of bending, because that's what I'm going to be doing in my sport. And then training the active strength of flexion and extension, and when I need it, to keep a flat back, because sometimes that is what I want to do. So knowing the positions I need to be in for the individual implements and events, training those specifically, and then making sure I hit all the little tiny stabilizer muscles in my shoulders and hips to support all of that movement.
I love that. Yeah. So controlling motion, especially in the side bending and rotation. And what's really interesting, listeners, is that it's going to be a little different when you are in a current active state of pain, because in some cases, when you're in an active state of pain, and this is what I often find is like when you're in an active state of pain and you know that there are specific activities that you know hurt, then that means that there are also specific motions that can actually provide relief. And the reality is that there's no position or movement that is too awkward. So if you're like, actually, I feel pain every time I get off the toilet, but the pain goes away if I take my right hand and I slide it down the backside of my right thigh, it makes the pain go away. Technically speaking, we're going to want to do more of that, but then it brings up the question, well, what about that motion is actually reducing your pain? Is it the extension that happens when you slide your hand down the backside of your thigh, or is it the rotation? And it's like, if that's the case, maybe we need a little bit of rotation in one direction and maybe a lot less rotation in another direction. But then there's another category of people where there's another category of people where the pain can actually be a result of having too much motion at the spine. And that's where it's important for us to make sure that we are in fact building up our core strength. So we're doing those different plank variations. But the second part is that if there's too much motion happening at the spine, that also tells us that there's not enough motion happening somewhere else. And what I find is that lack of motion is often present in the hips. So indicating, all right, well, if we're moving too much at the back, let's strengthen our back. Let's see where the range of motion is restricted in our hips so we can target that specific area. I worked with a lot of athletes, and one of the big things that people would come in working with me, they would say, Ashley, I hurt my back doing this sport. I can't deadlift, I can't squat, I can't do all these things. And then they all they want to do is just live pain free. And then rather than just creating that fear and saying, yes, never do X, Y, and Z, I'll actually flip the script on them and I'll say, okay, well, what can we do? What are the activities that we can do with minimal to no pain? Let's keep you active as much as possible, because not only is there a good physiological component to actually staying strong and like being physically active, there's also the emotional and mental side of it as well. Because if you're not exercising, if you're not moving on top of the pain, before you know it, you're going to be into this super deep pit of like negative self-talk and fear. And that is actually pretty hard to get out of, especially when you're going through this alone. So definitely if we're looking at like building up our stability, creating that tension, because knowing that we are going to have to be in these various different positions, it's one thing, yes, we can avoid them altogether, but the reality is not only in strongman, but in life, we're going to have to be put in these awkward positions. And so we can either go in with control and with confidence, knowing that we have put in the groundwork to make sure that we're able to do these things properly, or we have the fear, which can actually increase our likelihood of getting hurt and completely avoiding the specific activity, right? And so we talked about some of the things that, like the core components of especially the spine and some of the big lifts of strongman. We talked about some considerations, especially when someone is injured, trying to focus on how they can navigate that. Now for the folks who are like, all right, well, I'm feeling better. I love strongman, but I'm a little timid in getting back into this activity that I love, but it caused so much pain and suffering. What are some things to consider when getting back into the sport?
I think getting back into it is equal parts physical and mental. So you have to give yourself grace as you're getting back in, that you are not going to be where you were when you got hurt, and that's fine. And chances are you're going to be building back stronger than prior to injury, because you're going to be paying attention more to your form and to all these, like a lot of times, the little tiny muscles that you may have neglected, or a part of technique that you may have been missing. So you will come back stronger. You just have to give yourself time. And it's easier said than done, but you just have to forget your old numbers and your old times and just start wherever you are and be okay with that. So that's a big mental hurdle. Physically, I think especially people who are really competitive, want to go too fast too soon, and you're just going to be doing yourself a disservice. So letting your body, I prefer to use more of an RPE or RIR, so rating of perceived exertion or reps in reserve scale, than prescribing actual weights when people are getting back from injury. So we're basing your lifting on how your body is feeling today in this moment. And that might change from day to day. That might change from week to week. That is totally fine. But we want to be, when we're recovering from injury, in that pretty easy, like RPE 6 to 7 out of 10. So we can tell that we're doing something when we're going through the motions of a movement, we're doing it well. We have a little bit of load, but we're not anywhere near failure. As we get more confident again and as our body gets stronger again, then we can push like RPE 7, 8. But I don't want to see anybody in that, like, I rarely ask my lifters to go to a 9 or a 10 in general. Like outside of competition, I don't really want to see you lifting in that range, because the cost benefit, that's a whole other programming discussion. But typically I like people to hang out around like an 8 on primary lifts and like a 9, 8 to 9 on accessory lifts. And we just take all that and scale it back by like 2, essentially, when we're recovering. And then we work our way up both physically and mentally towards those heavier weights, and paying attention as we go to kind of what you said earlier, which is like, what positions do feel okay, what things make me feel maybe better, which is great, obviously more of that, and which things are still causing me a little bit of discomfort or are still causing me pain. And then we kind of like, just like boop the edges of those things here and there. So we'll kind of retest it, and if it's not there yet, that's fine, we'll pull back a little bit. But then you have to kind of like build with what you have, boop your comfort zone a little bit, and then come back a little, and then go up a little, come back a little, and then be very patient with that process. And it's very individual to the person. Like some people and some injuries bounce back quickly, some people don't, and there's not necessarily anything wrong with you. It just takes time, and it's different for everybody.
100% agreement with that too. Katie, I could talk with you all day about programming and rehab and strength stuff, but that is all the time that we have for today. So for the listeners who want to learn more, they want to work with you because you have a great track record, how can people get in touch with you?
You can find my extremely unactive Instagram, which is Katie Feely Strength. Or the best way to get me is via email, which is katiefeelystrength@gmail.com. I'm happy to answer any strongman questions, general strength. I have rehabbed myself. I have helped others get back into it, and it's all part of the sport, and I'm happy to help and answer questions and, talk about strongman or whatever.
Awesome. There you have it, listeners. Katie Feely Strength, the strongman expert. Katie, it's so great to see you, and thank you so much for your expertise.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure as always.
Thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you got some help from today's podcast. And for more info, check us out at ifixyoursciatica.com. Have a fantastic and pain-free day. No patient-therapist relationship is formed by listening to this podcast. We are not providing medical advice, and all information should be confirmed by a medical provider.